Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our third session of the fall 2023 season of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. And this afternoon, we are here to talk about a recent book by Jonathan Sperber of the University of Missouri entitled The Age of Interconnection, A Global History of the Second Half of the 20th Century, published earlier this year by Oxford University Press. Joining us this afternoon as our discussant is Catherine Epstein, the Provost and Dean of Amherst College. I'm Eric Arnesen from George Washington University. I co-chair the Washington History Seminar with Christian Ostermann of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, who can't be here with us this afternoon. The seminar is a collaborative and nonpartisan venture of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association, and we've been exploring new historical scholarship since 2010. A few quick FYIs before we get going. First, please take note, the next seminar will take place this coming Monday, October 2nd at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, when we return to discuss a new book by Alan Bollard entitled Economists in the Cold War, How a Handful of Economists Fought the Battle of Ideas. Second, as always, we like to recognize two people who work very hard behind the scenes to make the seminars possible, Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the American Historical Association. Third, on the logistics front, please note that today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And finally, when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom. We'll call on as many folks as we can, and you can start getting in the queue whenever you wish. With those preliminaries out of the way, we can get the seminar going. Jonathan Sperber received his PhD from the University of Chicago, and since 1984, he has been affiliated with the Department of History at the University of Missouri, most recently as the Curator's Distinguished Professor of History Emeritus. Among his books are, and this is not a complete list, The Kaiser's Voters, Electors, and Elections in Imperial Germany, published in 1997, Rhineland Radicals, The Democratic Movement and the Revolution of 1848-49, published in 91, The European Revolutions, 1848 to 1851, published in 1994 with a revised edition in 2005, and Karl Marx, A 19th Century Life, published in 2013, a book that has been translated into multiple foreign languages and has been a finalist for the 2014 Pulitzer Prize in Biography. And today, as I hope you know, he'll be talking about his latest work, The Age of Interconnection, A Global History of the Second Half of the 20th Century. Jonathan, it's a pleasure to have you. Welcome to the seminar.
Thank you for the gracious introduction. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. My talk about my book will be in 4 parts today. I'll start by talking about approaches. I'll go on to explain something about sources. I'll consider areas of emphasis, and then I'll talk about some of my conclusions. So to start with approaches, when I looked at what was written on this topic about global histories of the modern world, and especially the second half of the 20th century, I sort of found 2 approaches predominant. One we might associate with textbooks, in which there's a lot of, how can I put this nicely? There's a lot of stuff described. There's crises in Korea and Berlin and Laos and in Iraq and in Afghanistan. There's various technological marvels of space travel, medicine, computers. There's a lot of demonstrations and women demanding their rights. We might call this the Philomena Kunk School of Historical Studies, or to put it differently, history as basically a form of old newspaper headlines. A second approach we find in pundits who've written about this era, and their solution is basically slogans. Slogans like the world is flat, globalization, the singularity, and so on. I had to reject both these approaches, and I found a thematic approach better. I argued that there are 2 major themes by which we can approach the history of the second half of the 20th century. One is the idea that economic, cultural, political, demographic, informational relations cross the borders of sovereign states, continents, and oceans, creating interactive worldwide networks, which is why I call this book An Age of Interconnection. The second major theme is the influence of the previous historical era, the age of total war, 1914 to 1945-50, on the second half of the 20th century. This influence is extraordinarily widespread. We find it not just in obvious places like international relations, but in things like forms of technology or utopian political aspirations. The combination of these two major themes provides the framework in which I approach the history of the era. The first, which describes a sort of process that runs throughout the entire period. The second provides an opportunity for periodization. And I argue that the years between 1945 and the early to mid 1960s were a sort of post-war era in which the influence of the age of total war was very strong. The 60s and the 70s were an era of upheaval in which many of these structures were destroyed or dissolved. And the last 20 years of the century, the late millennial era, as my editor at OUP insisted they be called, are a period in the development of new structures, the origins of our contemporary condition. And what I did was to work at this thematically, to apply these 2 points of view to a wide variety of different topics, ranging from human interaction with the biosphere to migration, to consumer society, to religion, to utopian political aspirations that form the approach of the book. Now, to the second point about sources, there's been a lot of discussion about appropriate sources for writing a global history, and particularly the difficulty of providing primary sources to global history. For the second half of the 20th century, however, we have a unique opportunity, which is not available in earlier time periods, and that is one provided by the divisions and agencies of the United Nations. Some of these are well known. We have UNESCO or the World Health Organization. Others are more obscure, the International Telecommunications Union, or my personal favorite, the World Tourism Organization. But what we can say about all of them is they collect information from individual country statistical agencies, compile it, synchronize it, and make it available to a global public, at least at first, primarily in the form of printed volumes, but increasingly online. This is an enormously useful source of information and is the basis for most of the many charts and graphs in the book, which are a very distinct feature of this volume and sort of differentiate it from many other forms of global history. The second thing I'd say, of course, is about secondary sources. Like any other global history, any other work of synthesis, I am dependent on secondary sources to write my book. I have made a decision to work as much as I could directly from academic monographs. The idea of working from one general history to another general history, or from a general history to a general history to my general history, a sort of daisy chain of general histories, is something I try to reject. I try to work as closely as possible to sort of fresh scholarship in order to provide a source for my work. So the third point I would make concerns areas of emphasis. And here I would note that I'm sort of different from a lot of the people who've written global histories, especially global histories of the fairly recent past. They tend to fall into two groups. One are diplomatic historians, or international historians, as they like to call themselves these days, who feel they are, by their very title of their subspecialty, called upon to write global histories, although perhaps at times in a rather narrow way. The other group of historians who does this are Asianists, who feel that their part of the world has not gotten the due it deserves. And I think there's a good argument for that point of view. I'd mention in particular here the late C.A. Bailey and the German Jürgen Osterhammel. These are the two, I think, leading global historians of the modern world. My own background, of course, is different. I'm a historian originally of 19th century Europe. I'm a social historian, and a lot of my work has involved a number of features which I've tried to bring into this book, which are somewhat different from those often of other global historians. Things like social and gender structures, migration patterns, popular democratic mass political and social movements, the condition of labor in the workplace and in society more generally. Stuff like that, which is sort of a direct line from some of the things I studied in 19th century history, but also other features of 20th century society, whether it's television, tourism, consumerism, a number of other things, which are sort of, one might say, a social history approach to the second half of the 20th century. Another hat I wear is that I've been a historian, known as a historian of religion, and I've made an effort to explicitly address the role of religion in the contemporary world. One can see that both in the sections on it, but perhaps more broadly in that the chapter about ideas and actions is entitled Beliefs. So this have been some of the emphases I've used. Now, I'm not saying that my work exclusively deals with these features. There's many other things. There is a history of international relations. There's a history of science, of medicine and disease, history of utopian ideas, of all sorts of things in my book. But I do think my approach and emphases have been somewhat different from those of many people who have written global histories, especially global histories of the recent past. And now coming to the conclusions. Of course, it's a big book. There are a lot of conclusions. I'm just going to address three particular areas of conclusions that I have. One is the idea of the unprecedented nature of the era. This is something people say a lot about the second half of the 20th century. It is an unprecedented time, and I agree with that, but I've often found ways to do it which are somewhat different. For instance, the years 1950 to 1973 were the era of the fastest rates of economic and population growth in human history, not just before, but since. They form a unique sort of period here. Another example is the fact that a lot of these unprecedented things happened very late in our period. In 1960, atmospheric CO2 levels were just about 5% above their pre-industrial figures. The whole phenomenon of atmospheric CO2, global warming, carbon emissions is a very, very recent development. I think someone's pointed out that most CO2 emissions in all of human history have happened since 1990. So it's really a very recent development. Another example of something that really makes our contemporary condition, but is also very recent, is worldwide internet access. In 1995, there were 16 million people in the entire world who had access to the internet. By 2000, there were 361 million, and the number has increased exponentially ever since. A second point I would make here concerns, or another, actually, before I get to my second point, let me get to finish the third point, which is there are some areas one might not expect to see unprecedented results, but where we do. A particularly good example is the condition of women. Universities, since they were founded about 800 years ago, have been very much a guy thing. This began to change in the 1970s when, for the first time in some countries, women became a majority of university students. According to the UNESCO statistics in 1985, there were 23 countries in the world where women were a majority of students, and 84 where men were a majority. By 2010, there were 79 countries where women were a majority and just 23 where men were. This transformation of university student bodies is one of enormous examples of the changes of the condition of women, of gender ideals and gender structures, which I think are a characteristic, very important feature of this era and something quite different from the past. A second feature of my conclusions concerns the nature of globalization. There's a strong tendency to see the growth of international connections in places like migration, finance, trade, and the like, as leading towards a global cultural homogenization. A world culture, or another version we often see from pundits, is the idea of a global consumer culture where everybody eats at McDonald's, shops at H&M, and drives a Beamer, or at least aspires to do so. I would say this is actually fundamentally incorrect. Globalization in some areas, particularly in trade and finance and commerce, has led, in fact, to the growth of intransigent nationalism, intolerant religions, to very strong reactions against globalization. The third and final area in which I would like to discuss my conclusions concerns what I regard as a characteristic feature of this era, the gap between very broad and extreme expectations and more prosaic realities. There were very large-scale utopian expectations we associate with the year 1945, liberation from fascism, rebellion against imperial rule, and anti-imperialists imagined not just independence from colonial powers, but the creation of a new, better stage of European history. There were, of course, the mass movements of the 1960s, or maybe to quote Jefferson Airplane, we are seeking here and now a new continent of love and fire. And then, of course, there were the events of 1989, the belief, the end of history, in a new world order, a globalized world order of privatization, deregulation, and international financialization guaranteed by the benevolent hegemony of the United States. These are all distinctly utopian features. We also find utopian hopes for nuclear power, which would be too cheap to meter. Something that Homi Bhabha, not the literary critic, but India's leading nuclear physicist, asserted pretty much a few days after the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima, the belief that space travel would lead to the colonization of the solar system, that computers would be giant brains that think. We also saw equally enormous fears in the era, fears of nuclear war that would set back to human civilization or destroy all life on Earth, a population dystopia, an immense destruction of the environment, and frankly, utopian religious ideas. The two religions which have religious tendencies that have made the running in the last third or quarter of the 20th century, Salafist Islam, and evangelical Protestantism both had a very, very strong apocalyptic streak of fears and hopes of a divine new order. And yet we contrast this with the actual results in which none of these things have come to pass. That's really a characteristic feature of the era, and I would suggest that it is actually, ironically, much of the globalization of the era, usually seen as a disruptive force, which has proven to be more a conservative one, bringing a lot of these utopian aspirations to an end. But what I think I can say is that this is really a characteristic feature of this era, the gap between great expectations and more prosaic realities. And I think that's the point at which I'll stop and let Catherine provide us with her commentary.
Jonathan, thank you very much. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Catherine Epstein, the Provost and Dean of the Faculty and the Winkley Professor of History at Amherst College, to the seminar. She specializes in modern German and Central European history. She's the author of 4 books on German history, A Past Renewed, German-Speaking Refugee Historians in the United States After 1933, The Last Revolutionaries, German Communists and Their Century, published by Harvard in 2003.
Finished recording, you may hang up or press 1 for more options.
Okay. Sorry there. Model Nazi, Arthur Greiser and the Nazi Occupation of Western Poland, Oxford 2010, and a textbook, Nazi Germany Confronting the Myths, published in 2015. She served as associate editor of Central European History from 2004 to 2014, and currently serves on the boards of directors of the Friends of the German Historical Institute in Washington, D.C., and the board of directors of the American Friends of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. She's also a member of the Academic Committee of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Council. Catherine, welcome to the seminar. The screen is all yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the nice introduction. So quite simply, this is a remarkable book that Jonathan has written. He has done us really quite an amazing service. To me, the book commands a stream of positive adjectives. It's lucid, intelligent, erudite, readable, thoughtful, provocative. Jonathan has written a very compact account of a truly mind-spinning era, and he's done so in a very organized, coherent, and compelling fashion. So we've heard from Jonathan about some of the main, themes of the book, his main conclusions. I'd like to underscore some of the strategies that Jonathan uses to write such a capacious account. And for those who have not read the book, I hope that they further elucidate why this book merits special attention. And for those who have read it, I hope they serve as reminders about the content and the sweep of the volume. At the end of my comments, I will also pose some general comments. So what are the strategies? So the first strategy is that Jonathan displays an extraordinary command of facts. I wonder, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, how could he possibly know and write about so many things expertly? Surely there must be errors, I thought, but if they are there, I couldn't find them, save for the occasional typo. So the facts are amazing, and there are so many of them, and I just want to give a couple of examples. So for example, the importance of the shipping container, who knew? Introduced in the 1970s, it not only changed the labor situation of dock workers, but it also allowed for the multinational production of single products. The great example is Barbie, how apt. By the mid-1990s, the nylon for Barbie's hair came from Japan in containers, the plastics of her body from Taiwan, pigments for painting her plastic body from the United States. Barbie's parts were assembled in China on machines manufactured in Japan and Europe, and yet those machines use molds made in the United States. And finally, Barbie was shipped all around the world via containers. And this process was repeated with any number, a huge number of products. So that's one fact as an example. Another, plummeting fertility rates during this era were coupled with longer life expectancies. And this is such that in the 1960s, an era that we think of as the high water mark of youth and youth culture actually marked a low point in terms of the percentage of young people living on the planet. Another really interesting fact, changing gender norms. This has meant that in China, brides were no longer willing to live with the groom's family and to take care of the groom's aging parents. And this in turn led to changing practices in terms of paying bride wealth, but also to new migration practices as wealthier Chinese families imported workers from the Philippines as caretakers. And this, of course, all leads us to another set of facts. While the 1950s and early 1960s marked a low moment in global migration, migration exploded toward the end of the 20th century and continues to be very prevalent. At least 3.5% of the world's population, or some 272 million people as of 2019, were migrants. Yet the migration patterns that sort of encompassed all these migrants have changed very dramatically, from transatlantic migrations to new ones across the Pacific, the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the Red Sea. And virtually every page of this book has fascinating facts of the sorts that I just noted. So that's one strategy. Another strategy is that Jonathan does a really nice job of laying out different analyses of trends and then giving his own judicious reckoning. An example is a discussion of the wave of deregulation and privatization that occurred in the last decades of the 20th century, best exemplified by Margaret Thatcher's Great Britain. Markets were deregulated and privatized while taxes and government expenditures, especially on social welfare programs, were cut. And the argument, of course, was that firms would be more free to compete in the market, and as a result, they'd be more innovative, more efficient, and more productive. Consumers would enjoy lower prices, and so on. Jonathan, however, reviews the evidence from all around the world and shows that in Egypt and Nigeria, privatization allowed for public property to pass into the hands of politically well-connected families. This was even more true of Eastern Europe, where the extraordinarily quick transition from a Soviet style to a free market economy took place with disastrous results. And Jonathan more than once suggests that China got it right with its actually quite slow transition to a market economy. Even in Britain, though, the goals of privatization went largely unfulfilled. The public water utility was privatized, for example, but building a competing utility would have required building a huge infrastructure. Private firms now had control of the water, and they simply raised their rates with no fear of competition. So consumers lost out. They were paying more for their water supply instead of more on consumer goods and services. So that's another strategy. So the next strategy I want to talk about is how Jonathan frequently looks at texts, and it's actually usually 3 texts, to explore a moment in history and how intellectuals were grappling with it. And I really appreciate the role given to intellectual history in the account. So just as some examples, in discussing concerns about human interactions with the environment in the 1960s and 1970s, Jonathan looks at Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and the Club of Rome's Limits to Growth. And while laying out their concerns, Jonathan argues that the fears of Ehrlich and the Club of Rome, at least, did not come to pass, as he suggested in his opening comments. Due to the Green Revolution, humans on the planet continue to be able to feed themselves despite extraordinary population growth. Another example in this chapter on beliefs, Jonathan explores mid-century crises of progress, including J.R.R. Tolkien and his Lord of the Rings, Sayyid Qutb, an Egyptian intellectual who eventually came to call for worldwide jihad, and Dwight MacDonald, a New York writer and literary critic who questioned scientific, technological, and economic progress. And as Jonathan argues, when the authors wrote in the first post-war decades, they were seen as voices in the wilderness, but their voices eventually gained widespread adherence. And as a final example of sort of intellectual history and the role it plays in the book, in his discussion of utopian beliefs of the 20th century, Jonathan discusses what he calls 3 prophets of disillusion. So George Orwell's 1984, Milovan Djilos's The New Class, and Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. And their work emphasized the gap between expectations that arose out of the World War II era and the prosaic realities in the decades that followed. And these thinkers, I think, also presaged one of the major conclusions that Jonathan actually also mentioned when he was talking about the main conclusions he sees from his book, that the age of interconnection, in his words, quote, has been a force limiting the possibilities of the great hopes and equally great fears that have been prevalent around the world since the age of total war. And this coexistence of dramatic aspirations and prosaic realities has been a characteristic feature of the very recent past, shaping our present, and end quote. So the final strategy that I want to mention has to do with Jonathan being very attentive to unintended consequences. So things happen in ways one would not have predicted, and it is a strength that he lays this out time and time again. I think the most striking is the unintended consequence of the collapse of the Berlin Wall. So as Jonathan argues, persuasively, I think, 1989 led to 9/11. That is, 11/9 became 9/11. But the way in which the United States exercised its role as a hegemonic power greatly exacerbated militant anti-American feeling, not least among Arab populations that were increasingly Islamicized. It is also striking how poorly the United States played its hand right after 1989, but especially with the invasion of Iraq as the response to 9/11. And by the second decade of the 21st century, all the features of the post-1989 order had come undone. So American hegemony, multilateralism, and globalized and deregulated markets no longer held sway. Similarly, I was struck by Jonathan's insights about how the growth of a global economy has left countries more equal in relationship to each other, but to greater stratification within each society. So while China and India, about 40% of the world's population, accounted for less than 8% of global economic output in 1973, together they accounted for 19% in 2001, leading to a global redistribution of wealth. But at the same time, in wealthier countries with slower economic growth after 1973, the benefits of that growth went primarily to the wealthiest 10% of the population. The affluent did much better than wage earners, and not least because manufacturing and other lower paying jobs were exported to other countries around the world. So, and another unintended consequence, while one might naively have thought the growing global interconnections of manufacturing, of labor markets, of communication might have led to more cosmopolitanism and multiculturalism, Jonathan is very clear that it has generally led to more religious intolerance and a growth of nationalism. And television is a really good example of this. For decades, television was primarily prevalent in wealthier societies, but by 2010, a majority of the world's population had a television in their homes. But the regulatory, economic, and technological changes that have occurred mean that TV viewing is now less of a community experience. And in Jonathan's words, quote, in place of the curated limited options and shared viewership in which TV originated, they, that is the various changes, have created a multi-channel world, less shared, more fragmented, and containing the potential for individual self-curation of the TV experience, and end quote. So while all these strategies that I've outlined suggest the strengths of the work, I think there are places, of course, where we could probe Jonathan a bit more. So one of these is terminology. Is the age of interconnection really the best term for the second half of the 20th century? After all, there's always been global interconnection, and as Jonathan writes, its growth over this era was very uneven. What made this era so different was how much more interconnection there was and how much more that interconnection impacted human lives, regardless of social strata, geographical location, and so on. So in his conclusion, Jonathan talks about how this period was really one of exponential growth, as he also did in his remarks, of course, and perhaps this better captures what really happened in the second half of the 20th century. There are also some persistent questions that I have, and that is, why is Africa always at the bottom? Is this due to the legacy of colonialism, or are there other ways to interpret developments in Africa? I would say that the book is also at some level profoundly distressing as we think forward to what's coming. How did we, that is human society, end up in this current quite miserable plight? Is this simply human nature? Did human agency really lead to what seems like the worst of all possible outcomes short of nuclear annihilation? Or put otherwise, were there other plausible roads not taken in the late 20th century that might have led to a different 21st century? And as many others have noted, nationalism has actually trumped over virtually every other ideology in the modern world. And in Jonathan's reading, growing globalization only gives further impetus to local, regional, and state actors emphasizing their own particularities. But is there any hope of halting the attraction of authoritarian nationalist leaders, from Putin to Russia, in Russia to Erdogan in Turkey, Xi in China, and of course, Trump and Trump wannabes in the United States? Finally, I'm always really interested in the motivations that historians bring to the work that they do, as well as the challenges that they face in doing the work that they do. And so I'm curious as to why Jonathan chose to write this book. He talked about it a little bit in his remarks, but originally you were a historian of 19th century Germany, and what did actually lead you to write a global history of the post-1945 era? I think, what were you trying to learn, and what did you learn by writing the book? And what's next in terms of your scholarship and writing? In conclusion, I really want to thank Jonathan for providing us with such a remarkable work, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Catherine. Before we turn back to Jonathan, can I invite you in the audience to get in the queue? You can use the raise hand function, which means I get to call on you, you unmute, and you get to pose your question. Or if you use the Q&A function, you can type in your question and then I get to read it. We prefer you to raise your hand if you can, but either way, now is the time to start getting in that lineup. Jonathan, thoughts about what Catherine had to say?
All right, thank you, Kat. Thank you, Catherine, for such a very gracious commentary. Let me first briefly say about the question of the title. My literary agent, John Wright, who I'm sorry to say died just before the publication of this book, told me you're going to have to call it The Age of Something. That's an absolute requirement of writing a general history. And so it took me a long time to figure this out. And eventually I came up with the idea of an age of interconnection. It's certainly true that there's a period of exponentially rapid growth, and a lot of the social and economic features of the era are characteristic, can be understood in this way. But other things like international relations don't really fit very well into the idea of a period of exponential growth. So that's not entirely appropriate as a title. A more serious question that Catherine brings up is the whole issue of Africa and Africa's place in a globalized world. This is something that particularly anthropologists have been talking about for quite a while now. And give me a second. I need to do something to All right, anthropologists have been talking about this for quite a while now, and I would say that going on this discussion, here's my personal take on what's been going on. Sub-Saharan Africa in the pre-industrial era was characterized as a region of poor soil fertility, a lot of disease-bearing microorganisms, low population density, less possibility for the development of complex civilizations. As a result, it became the victim of multiple slave trades. This was followed by imperialism, which has continued well beyond the end of formal colonialism. And of course, we've seen in recent years new imperial powers appear in Africa, Russia and China, for instance. And I think a very failed transition from imperial rule to independence, which is actually one of the major features, though often overlooked, of Frans Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. The upshot of this has been that global trends, things like the slowdown in economic growth after 1973, the decline in the strength of labor, the growth of precarious labor relations, the resurgence of infectious disease after 1980 affect everyone, but they affect Africa worse. That's what I would say is the primary issue here. And I guess I'll just, Catherine's asked me to talk about myself, and of course, academics always love to do that. So the question is, how did I come to write this book? It is certainly, definitely a transition from most of my previous scholarship. And the answer was after I finished my last book, my biography of Karl Marx, I realized I'd been studying 19th century Europe for almost 4 decades. I really had nothing new to say about it. And so I thought I'd like to move into a new time period. And I thought, particularly the second half of the 20th century, still relatively little studied compared to the age of total war. And also, encompasses my life. I was born in 1952, and this was an opportunity for me to think at some length about all these chaotic events and how they could be organized, put together, put in a causal relationship. This was a real incentive. As for why a global history, once again, I have to say my agent was pretty insistent on that. But also I was inspired by one of the great global historians of our day, Jürgen Osterhammer. I reviewed for HNet his The Transformation of the World, his global history of the 19th century, was immensely impressed. But I also began thinking, well, can I do that? And I'm not sure the answer to that question, but I've certainly tried to do that. And as for future plans, at my age, one shouldn't be too certain about anything. But I will say that I do have a project I am pursuing. It's in the same time period, but it's a very different kind of book, not a work of synthesis, but one based on a very intensive use of primary sources and not focused on the whole world, but on a single city. It's going to be a book about the city of Berlin in the age of the High Cold War, between the airlift and the wall, the one place during that period where the Eastern Bloc and the Western powers had to live in the same actual urban space. Also a period in which the impact of the age of total war was particularly apparent. And so that's what I'm hoping to do in the future, or at least I'm working on that right now. And it's rather different from what I've done, I did with this book, but it sort of falls into the same general new direction. So once again, I want to thank both Eric and Catherine for their very generous comments and giving me the opportunity to talk about my book. And I'll be happy to deal with questions now.
Great. We have a hand up with Katrin Schultheis. Unmute and join the conversation.
Yes, hi. I have not read the book, though it sounds very impressive. My question has to do with the immensity of a project like this, which, as Catherine said, has lots and lots and lots of facts, and as you were explaining, has lots and lots of themes. But what do you see as an undercurrent tying this all together? But you said in your remarks that you didn't want to write a general history, that was just a bunch of stuff. So how did you avoid a bunch of stuff? And what do you see as, most people either see politics as driving history in general, or they see the environment as driving history in general, or it's economics that drive it. is there any underlying theme that you see as a primary driver of the history you've written here, or do you just see it as like a bunch of chapters that all speak to this period of time?
Thank you.
All right. I guess what I would say to that is as I think about my own narrative, it seems to me a lot of it is driven by the development of technology, economic and demographic structures. But there's a whole other area in which that's not true. In international relations, in ideas about politics, and those really, it seems to me, involve playing out some of the themes that developed in the age of total war. That's why this isn't a one-theme book, but if you will, a two-theme book. And it's the interaction of those two, which the interaction is often very different in very different areas of human existence. That seems to me like the chief way that I tried to articulate the history of this era.
We have two hands, Leon Fink and Sonia Michelle. First, Leon Fink. Oh, Sonia's hand is up. Let's do Sonia.
Thank you, because I have to leave soon. I was at a seminar yesterday on a new book that just came out, the global labor migration. So this is very much on my mind. And one of the major themes of that seminar was the feminization of migration in this period that you're talking about, and more recently as well. And I wonder if you touch on that in your book. And relatedly, I wonder if you talk about the relationship between migration, especially of women from poor countries to richer countries, and the impact that that's had on welfare states. And that, of course, relates to nationalism as well.
Sonia, the short answer to your question is yes. To both your questions is yes, particularly the first question. This really is a big change from past forms of migration, especially the great pre-1914 migrations, which were very much a guy thing. And so I have talked about those things. So the answer to your question is yes, I do. And I would invite you to take a look at my chapter on migration and see how it interacts with what you've had to say.
Thank you. Thank you. Leon Fink. Unmute.
Yes, Jonathan, I much have enjoyed just picking at your book just through a few chapters. But in answer to, it seems like there is a link between your earlier work that I see, being familiar with your work on Marx, though you're not a Marxist, maybe you're a non or anti-Marxist in my reading, but nevertheless, you immersed yourself in not only in Marx, but the world of social theory deriving from Marx. And I can't help but read Eric Hobsbawm into this volume, a kind of updated Hobsbawmian treatment of the period. I mean, that has his masterful command of synthesis, with a strong, I would say, still strong economics and technology focus, as you yourself allow, although you clearly go beyond that. But I wanted to ask you in relation to the elements of your synthesis, how you approach not the danger so much as the temptations of structuralism, and whether you found yourself having to worry about that subject of if not structuralism, determinism, would be another pejorative, I guess, that one could fall into. And I guess the one chapter that I read carefully was the one on labor, not surprisingly, being a labor historian, but I did feel that as well versed as that chapter is, there is a kind of structuralist denouement to the chapter, that labor has basically been tamed in a way that doesn't seem to jive with the world that we live in at this moment. Now, admittedly, the book is not doesn't try to bring things up to the present moment, but do you worry yourself about the problem of structuralism as you try to get a grip on major themes?
So, Liam, three brief remarks in response to your very interesting questions. One, I like to call myself a post-Marxist, so I hope that will help. Two, about the problem of structuralism, or we might say the question of agency. This is very difficult when you're writing a book about the entire world and you're looking at big themes and big developments over a period of 55 years. Often agency tends to disappear. That's a danger of this sort of historical study. I will say that in the chapters on the last section of the book, which I call Dreams and Nightmares, and the chapters on beliefs, on mass murder, and on utopias, I think agency appears in a much stronger form. And the third thing is about writing about the recent past. And, when by the time you're finished writing the book, a lot of the things you thought at the beginning are no longer true. When I started thinking about this around 10 or 11 years ago, I would have said the chief response to the 1990s was opposition to the globalized vision of the end of history came from Islamicism. Today, I would say it comes from authoritarian nationalism. So when you write about the recent past, you just have to take that into account. When I wrote about results of the 19th century, it was a lot easier because that was a long time ago and we've seen what happened. It is true that labor is currently, at least in this country, undergoing a bit of an upsurge, but it's still way behind where it had been in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s.
Thank you. I have some questions of my own that I want to get in here if I can. So as I was reading this book, I was reminded just how little I know about so many things, including how little I knew about things I didn't even know I didn't know about. This speaks to Catherine's remarks about just the scope and the breadth of what it is that you do. So perhaps this will sound like an odd question, but I'm wondering what you left out. And so I imagine that while Oxford University Press might have very generously allowed you many pages, they might have exercised some business sense and said, there's a word limit here. So if they said, what the heck, another 50,000 words, and you got 2 more chapters, are there other subjects, or do you feel like you kind of covered it all, or at least enough of it to tie it all together?
In the original prospectus, there was going to be a chapter on the arts and a chapter on science and scholarship. And although I did get into those a little bit, as Catherine so very generously pointed out, there was a lot more that could be said about it. One of the reviewers, actually one of the very favorable reviewers, noted I had nothing to say about things like existentialism or postmodernism, other major intellectual movements which have encompassed the globe. I think that's actually true. And the book is already way too long as it is. But if I had those extra 50,000 words, I think that's where they would have gone.
Okay, good to know. So there are even more things I don't know about that I could have learned about. I'm wondering as well about, and Catherine, talked about this, the way in which you pose different texts against each other, and you kind of lay out at various points, the disaster scenarios, the Club of Rome, the exhaustion of resources, the population explosion, and the prospect of mass starvation, and in the end, those apocalyptic visions, I guess happily, do not come to pass. So yes, the world doesn't come to an end. And for many people in the book, you show life does get better. But for many people in the book, it struck me, if with a different author or a different spin or a different take, this could really be, the age of many catastrophes. And, for just to give one example, you talk about job loss in the era of containerization and the globalization of manufacturing and the rise of China, and perhaps, some 2 million jobs were lost in the early 21st century to China, and then another 1.7 million after that. And you acknowledge that some people say other things compensate. There are new jobs for other people, but still, for the people who lose their jobs, this is pretty bad. Going from a unionized, steel job to, I don't know, working in Walmart, or in the chapters on migration. I mean, just the vast quantities of suffering, or in the chapter on disease. Yes, some diseases are cured, but still millions of people die. So I'm just wondering, if you could just reflect, on kind of the character of, if your scope is smaller than the apocalypse scenarios, still for millions of people living through this period, the suffering is pretty cataclysmic, right?
Well, thank you, Eric. That's probably the first time anyone has said that I'm not pessimistic enough. I'm generally known as rather a pessimist. Everything what you say is true, and I can't deny it. But we can say a couple of things about this, about disease, for instance. The three big infectious disease killers, tuberculosis, malaria, and I'm blanking on the third.
Smallpox.
Anyway, each of these three killed about 100 million people in the first half of the 20th century. So that's more than died in both world wars. So I mean, that's really this really is a change, and it's certainly true that a lot of Americans lost their jobs, but the people in China, the largest country in the world, had an extraordinary increase in prosperity, and a global viewpoint needs to take that into account. Not to deny anything of what you said. And there are some chapters which are unbelievably bleak. The chapter on mass murder, I think, particularly, is an example of like one catastrophe after another in this century.
And one kind of follow-up to this, I'm kind of struck by the predictions of doom and gloom that didn't pan out the way the predictors suggested. So does this say to you that the business of reading forward and making predictions about the future is inherently a iffy kind of proposition? And I'm thinking now, if you wanted to kind of update the list of man, are we in trouble categories, one would be artificial intelligence, which will either save us all or wipe out all jobs, or Skynet will come and the Terminators will arrive. Big theme in mass, movies, over the last bit of time. Or you could spin that out on any number of other scenarios. So are these folks doing a kind of a cultural critical service by posing these questions? Or do you feel confident that whether it's AI or global warming, which you write about, that somehow whatever the predictions are, we can be assured they ain't going to play out the way that the pundits and the predictors are suggesting?
Well, as they say in investment prospectuses, past performance is no guarantee of future returns. So I can't really say about that. One of the reasons I became a historian was so I didn't have to make predictions, which is something which I find very comforting. I could just study stuff which had already actually happened. Those two examples you give, I would say, it seems to me AI is particularly an example of hype, and really not a big deal. Global warming seems a more serious issue. And I'm sitting here sweltering in my lightweight jacket because it's like 85 degrees at the end of September, which even for mid-Missouri is pretty hot. So I guess seeing the past can, on the one hand, give us a certain amount of skepticism about apocalyptic claims, but it can also reveal new features that have developed recently, which in fact were not present in the 1950s and 1960s. And so that does provide an element of warning. I hope that's not, that's what I can say about that.
Thanks. So a final question from me. And this has to do with how you would describe the book historiographically. So the Marx biography clearly was taking on a body of scholarship, and it cast Marx as a 19th century figure in a way that many of those who still cling to him or invoke him or see him as a tribune of things to come, it suggests that they should rethink this. So it's a political intervention, but it's an historiographical intervention. How would you describe this book's intervention? It's got so many different parts. So I assume that any given chapter might be entering a conversation or a debate, but either individually or collectively, how would you describe it? If pressed.
If you really press me on this, I would say that above all, it's an extension of the approach of Jürgen Osterhammel, the 19th century, to the second half of the 20th. Perhaps that's what I would say about it. It's an effort to bring some ways of seeing the 19th century world into the more recent past. I wouldn't want to even go any further than that. Particularly because there just hasn't been a whole lot of stuff written on this big scale on the second half of the 20th century. It's sort of I don't want to say it's a pioneering work, but it's a very interesting, it's an unusual, it's in a field which is still not very well populated.
So quick follow-up then, were you to advise graduate students about topics in a field that hasn't been well populated by monographs, are there any specific areas you would point them to with regard to what you cover here? Are there areas that you would like them to explore further?
When I look at the history, I see a whole bunch of areas which really historians have tended not to address. Things like air travel, electronics, TV. So much of the space travel, so much of the technological developments of the second half of the century, they've been done by this really sort of mediocre insider history, mostly people who are not trained historians, who have this very teleological view of things, professional NASA historians and the like. I really like to see historians get into a lot of this stuff, write about computers, TV, cars, airplanes, and their history. I think that would actually be really good.
So for graduate students who are listening, if there are still jobs out there in the future, just keep those in mind. I'm looking here. We don't have further questions, I don't believe. Catherine, your hand is up.
I have a question. Yeah. So, we've been talking quite a bit about how this era has almost been an era of catastrophes in various ways and forms. But what I'm curious about is whether in the end you sort of concluded that interconnection led to stability, because in the end it's prosaic realities, that sort of thing. There was always the argument with the European Union. If you had a European Union, there'd be lots of interconnections. Trade partners don't necessarily fight with each other, those kinds of questions. So I'm wondering if you sort of came down in the end to thinking that interconnection and sort of what you were talking about was really a pretty stable world, or how would you think about sort of the relationship between the trends you describe and stability?
Yeah, interconnection has clearly changed a lot, but it has certainly prevented some of the wild apocalyptic things. Globalization and the creation of a worldwide market led to the end to the chief rival to capitalism, the communist economies of the Eastern Bloc. It led to the defanging Pache Leon Fink of labor, an important source of utopian aspirations. It played an important role in bringing a lot of the utopian aspirations of the 1960s to an end. The development of greater equality between nations and greater inequality within nations, which is an idea of the economist Branko Milanovic, which I happily appropriated for my book, has played a large role in that respect too. The growth of worldwide consumer aspirations, not necessarily consumption, because a lot of the world can't afford it, but the growth of worldwide consumer aspirations has been another element of the prosaic. And so I think that is really, especially when compared with the age of total war, which was a pretty wild ride for humanity over a period of 30, 35 years, in spite of horrible things that seem like could happen any minute, like thermonuclear warfare, none of it has. And so I guess I would say that this is an age of big expectations, but more prosaic realities.
Thank you. So I see no more questions in our queue. So I want to say thank you to all of you, to Jonathan and Catherine, those of you in the audience, those who asked questions. And I will just say that this is a sizable book, and each not self-contained, but they can be read discreetly. Chapter covers so much more than we were able to get at in our time this afternoon. And despite all of the information in there, it's a very readable book as well. I would ask you to remember that our next session is in just a handful of days. On Monday, October 2nd, we return at 4 p.m. Eastern Time to explore a new book by Alan Ballard of Victoria University in New Zealand entitled Economists in the Cold War, How a Handful of Economists Fought the Battle of Ideas. So again, thank you, everyone. Until next Monday, good night.